Mark Clayton loved the glass conference room. He didn't just like it, he depended on it. It was perched on the 30th floor of the Clayton Tower in downtown Chicago, a cube of absolute transparency that looked down on the city's grid, forcing everyone inside to feel exposed, responsible, and, most importantly, subordinate to him. Mark was a man who didn't just manage a company, he curated an image. His brand was built on restraint. He wore suits that looked expensive but never flashy, drove a German sedan that suggested reliability, not indulgence, and spoke in the clipped, measured tones of someone who found enthusiasm fiscally reckless. He was the self-appointed financial adult in the room, and he made sure everyone knew it. Admiration comes from control, people, he'd often lecture, pounding a perfectly manicured hand lightly on the polished mahogany table, not from spending, not from growth necessarily, but from the cold, hard discipline of the dollar. This particular Tuesday was the monthly Executive Financial Review, a ritual of corporate pain where department heads were dragged over the coals for every nickel spent, every budget overrun, and every delayed invoice. It was Mark's favorite meeting because it reinforced his central authority. He needed to be seen as the only sane mind managing the chaos, the singular force holding the line against the natural human tendency toward waste. The room was quiet, too quiet. 7 managers sat around the long table, each radiating varying levels of anxiety. They knew the routine. Mark would spend the first hour lecturing about the abstract concept of cash flow responsibility. Then he would demand granular data, using the dashboard Evelyn Grace controlled to pinpoint specific failures.
Evelyn was already there, positioned silently in the corner near the large presentation screen. She was Mark's executive secretary, though that title barely covered the scope of her duties. She was the company's institutional memory, the keeper of the schedules, the organizer of the chaos, and most pertinent to this meeting, the operator of the shared financial dashboard. Evelyn was the definition of quiet efficiency. She dressed in sensible colors, kept her hair pulled back tightly, and spoke only when spoken to, usually in precise, brief sentences. She had been with Mark for 8 years, long enough to see behind the carefully constructed facade. She knew the difference between the numbers Mark presented to the board and the numbers he lived by. Today, Evelyn felt a dull, persistent ache of resentment. Last week, she had worked nearly 60 hours closing out the quarterly reports, a necessary, high-stress effort. When she submitted her overtime request, Mark had sent it back with a note scrawled in red pen. "Discipline, Evelyn. We manage time. We don't buy more of it." It was a small thing, really, maybe $1,000 pre-tax. But coming from a man who spent triple that on a single dinner wine, it felt like a slap in the face, a petty assertion of power designed purely to remind her of her place. Evelyn didn't show her feelings. She just nodded, processed the regular pay, and filed the memory away. She learned long ago that the most dangerous people in a company aren't the loud ones, they are the quiet ones who hold the keys to the data. Mark began his lecture, standing at the head of the table, his reflection shimmering slightly in the glass walls.
"Look around you," Mark commanded, sweeping his arm toward the cityscape. "That city runs on predictable cash flow. Our business is no different. We are not artists, we are engineers of stability. And lately, gentlemen and ladies," he nodded curtly toward Maria, the head of HR, "I am seeing too much drift, too much assumption that the money will simply be there." He paced slowly. "I need discipline. I need restraint. I need you to think of every dollar leaving this company as a dollar ripped from my personal wallet, because ultimately that is exactly what it is." He went on for 45 minutes, hitting all the usual keywords: lean operations, zero-based budgeting, fiscal responsibility. The managers nodded mechanically, some taking notes they knew they would never review. Near the back of the room, tucked away by the door, sat Andrew Russell. Andrew was a junior accounts assistant, only 24, brought in primarily to take detailed minutes and learn the review process. He was quiet, wore thick glasses, and was intensely observant. He wasn't important enough to be nervous. He was just recording the theater. Mark finally moved to the crux of the meeting, turning to Evelyn. "Evelyn, thank you for setting up the dashboard. Let's look at Q2 variances. Standard view, please." Evelyn, without speaking, tapped a few keys. The large screen instantly populated with the standard corporate summary. Quarterly revenue up 4%, expenses contained, profit margin steady. It was the sanitized, public version of the company's health, the numbers Mark used to impress investors. He pointed triumphantly at the green bars. "See? Stability. But stability is fragile. It is built on the backs of your departments making hard choices. Now, I want to drill down. I want to see how this stability is being managed on a daily basis.
He paused, his eyes sweeping the table, daring anyone to challenge his authority. I want full, unadulterated transparency. Evelyn, if you recall, 3 weeks ago I asked you to prepare a new report for this meeting, a report that shows not just the quarterly totals, but the live cash flow, the real-time movement. I want to see the velocity of the money, minute by minute, day by day. I want them to see the reality of how close we sail to the edge. Mark smiled, a predator's flash of teeth. He had commissioned this report purely as a scare tactic. He figured if the managers saw the daily fluctuations, they would be terrified into greater efficiency. He had been so focused on using the report against them that he had completely forgotten that a truly live, unadulterated cash flow report doesn't discriminate. It shows all transfers. I need them to see the real numbers, Evelyn, Mark repeated, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. Show them the real numbers. Show them the truth. Evelyn met his gaze for a fleeting second, her expression utterly neutral. She did not hesitate. She did not even breathe differently. She simply reached down to the keyboard. This was not the standard report Mark thought he was demanding. This was the specific, specialized, live report he had requested weeks ago, a direct feed from the Treasury Management System, bypassing the usual filters and summaries. It was designed for deep forensic accounting, not for public display. With a soft click, Evelyn switched the source mic. The corporate summary vanished. The green bars were replaced by a chaotic, constantly updating stream of data, color-coded for urgency and categorized by account type. It wasn't static. The numbers were rolling, flickering, updating every 10 seconds as new transactions cleared the system. A collective, silent stiffening went through the room. This was not the usual polished PowerPoint presentation. This was the engine room.
The first thing that jumped out was the rolling account balance, displayed prominently at the top of the screen in a surprisingly small font, but impossible to ignore. Dash $124,567.89. It was negative. A manager, Susan, who handled logistics, stopped tapping her pen against her notepad. The sound had been a nervous tick for the last 20 minutes, and its sudden cessation was louder than any shout. Mark was still talking, mid-sentence, already launching into his analysis of the fear the manager should be feeling. Look at that, people. See how quickly the balance changes? We are always on the razor's edge. He broke off. He hadn't yet looked at the screen himself, relying on Evelyn to display the data that reinforced his narrative. When he finally turned his head, following the terrified stares of his executives, the color drained from his face. The screen updated again. Dash $131,209.45. The number was dipping, and below the main balance, the system provided a summary of recent high-value transactions, color-coded by urgency. The categories were brutal. Transaction type, amount USD, status, date time, notes. Incoming revenue, client Omega Corp, $450,000, delayed, pending, T+3, requires manual verification. Outgoing, supplier TechServe Solutions, $89,000, pending, hold, 07/15/2024. Payment scheduled for 07/28/2024. Outgoing, personal transfer, MC, $50,000, urgent, 07/12/2024, cleared. Wire transfer, Cayman offshore account. Outgoing, personal transfer, MC, $75,000, urgent, 07/14/2024, cleared. ACH transfer, private real estate. Outgoing, payroll, $155,000, critical, due today, requires immediate funding. Andrew Russell, the junior accounts assistant, sitting quietly by the door, didn't just see the numbers, he saw the dates. He had been processing supplier invoices that morning. He knew intimately that the TechServe Solutions payment of $89,000 had been pushed back indefinitely yesterday, citing temporary liquidity concerns. The dates on the two personal transfers made by MC, Mark Clayton, were July 12th and July 14th. The TechServe payment was scheduled for the 15th and then held. Andrew's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the urgent personal transfers, then at the stalled supplier payment, then back up at the rolling negative balance. The company wasn't operating leanly. It was operating on a knife edge, fueled by delayed payments and drained by urgent personal requisitions. The room was absolutely silent now. Mark's mouth was slightly open. He had been advocating for discipline while operating with breathtaking recklessness. He had demanded transparency, and Evelyn, with perfect cold professionalism, had delivered it in full. He looked at Evelyn, searching for malice, for defiance, for anything that indicated she had done this deliberately to expose him. But Evelyn's face was a study in blankness. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, as if meticulously ensuring the data feed was stable. Mark cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. He tried to reclaim the narrative, to smooth over the terrifying red numbers. "Well," he began, trying to force a laugh, "there you have it, the raw truth. A little volatile, perhaps, but that is the nature of business. We see here the impact of—" He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. The screen updated again, and the rolling balance dropped further. The system, designed to be helpful, flashed a small red warning icon next to the negative balance. Liquidity alert. Rolling balance has dipped below internal emergency threshold for the third time this month. The entire performance, the 8 years of carefully constructed restraint and control, evaporated in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the glass conference room. The managers didn't look at Mark. They looked at the screen. They weren't looking at their department's failures anymore. They were looking at Mark's. Ever wondered what financial transparency really costs? Subscribe to see more stories of corporate power dynamics and the people who expose them. They saw the temporary liquidity concerns that had forced them to slow down operations, and they saw exactly where the liquid funds had gone, to Cayman and private real estate, marked urgent. Mark knew he had lost the room. He had lost his authority. He had lost the crucial, defining element of his professional identity, the image of the responsible adult. If he tried to explain, he would only draw more attention to the urgent offshore transfer. If he tried to dismiss the screen, he would look like a liar. He looked at Evelyn again. She was waiting for his instruction, her hands hovering above the keyboard, ready to comply. She had followed his exact order. Show them the real numbers. Mark took a shaky breath. "Right," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. He straightened his tie, a purely habitual motion that failed to restore his composure. I think we've seen enough of the real-time data for today," Mark said, forcing the words out. "Evelyn, thank you. You can dismiss the meeting." Dismiss the meeting. Not adjourn, not postpone, but dismiss. It was 10:15 a.m. The meeting was scheduled until noon. Evelyn didn't move to turn off the screen immediately. She simply looked up at the managers. "The meeting is dismissed," she stated, her voice calm and clear. The managers rose immediately, grabbing their notepads. There was no discussion, no chatter about projects, no usual corporate politeness. They filed out of the glass room in absolute silence, avoiding eye contact with Mark, their faces carefully blank. They had seen something they were not supposed to see, and the unspoken agreement was that it would never be mentioned. Andrew Russell, the junior assistant, stood up last, gathering his notes. He glanced one last time at the screen. The balance was still negative, the urgent transfer still listed. He walked past Mark, who was standing frozen by the table, staring at the data as if it were a physical assailant. The room emptied completely. Mark was left alone, standing guard over his exposed secrets. Evelyn, still by the keyboard, was the only other person remaining. She didn't leave. She didn't look at Mark. She just waited for his next instruction. The screen remained on, glowing brightly in the glass room, broadcasting the ugly, volatile truth of Mark Clayton's financial discipline to the empty chairs. The rolling balance updated again. Negative $135,012.11. Mark finally moved, walking slowly to the screen, his polished shoe catching the reflection of the red numbers. He reached out a trembling hand, as if to touch the dollar amount, then pulled it back. "Evelyn," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all authority. "Turn it off." Evelyn pressed a single button, and the screen went black. The sudden darkness felt heavy. "Is that all, Mr. Clayton?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "That is all." Evelyn gathered her minimal materials and walked towards the door. She passed Mark without a word. As she reached the threshold, Mark called out, his voice low and dangerous. "Evelyn, I asked you to show the real numbers, and you did." Evelyn stopped, her hand on the cold steel of the door handle.
"I followed your instructions precisely, Mr. Clayton," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "You requested the live feed. It is unfiltered." She opened the door and stepped out, leaving Mark completely alone in the silent glass box overlooking the bustling, predictable city, a city that ran on the stability he had just proven he lacked. He was no longer the adult in the room. He was just a reckless spender, exposed by his own demand for transparency. Mark stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in. He had spent years building a reputation, and in 3 minutes it had been dismantled by a few lines of code and the quiet compliance of his secretary. He had underestimated Evelyn Grace. He had mistaken her quiet demeanor for meekness, her efficiency for loyalty, and her need for overtime pay as a sign of financial desperation rather than professional principle. He ran a hand over his face. He needed to spin this. He needed to control the narrative before those managers started talking. But how do you spin an urgent wire transfer to the Cayman Islands that directly precedes a supplier payment hold? He walked back to the table and picked up his phone. He needed his crisis communications team immediately, but as he unlocked the screen, he hesitated. The first call he needed to make wasn't to PR, it was to his bank. He had to cover the payroll due today, the one marked critical on the screen. He had prioritized a down payment on a foreign property over paying his own staff. The realization hit him with physical force. His performance of control was so convincing, even he had started to believe his own myth. He dialed his private wealth manager, his voice tight. "We need to execute a large transfer immediately, from the investment portfolio. No, don't ask why, just do it."
He hung up, pacing the perimeter of the conference table. The managers were gone, but the data lingered in the air. He had demanded transparency, and the truth had cost him more than $135,000. It had cost him the respect that was the foundation of his power. Mark looked out over the city. He needed to understand how Evelyn had managed to remain so calm. Was it deliberate, or was it truly just procedure? He couldn't afford to believe it was deliberate. If she had acted with intent, she was dangerous. If it was just procedure, he was simply stupid for forgetting what he had asked her to prepare. He decided he needed to speak to her again, not angrily, not defensively. He needed to gauge her intent, to see if he could bring her back under control, perhaps with a large retroactive bonus, a silent bribe to ensure her continued silence. He left the glass room and walked quickly down the long hallway toward the administrative section. Evelyn's desk was exactly where it always was, organized and spotless. She was already back at work, typing steadily. He stopped beside her desk. "Evelyn," he said, trying to infuse his voice with calm authority. She looked up immediately, her expression still unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Clayton." "About the meeting," he began, lowering his voice slightly. "That live feed, it was a bit jarring for the executives, wasn't it? Very raw data." "It was the report you requested, sir," Evelyn confirmed. "The unfiltered real-time cash flow." Yes, unfiltered," Mark repeated, leaning slightly closer. "But perhaps next time, we can ensure the parameters are set to exclude certain proprietary transfers. We don't need to confuse the department heads with treasury operations, do we?" Evelyn paused her typing. She looked at him directly, and for the first time there was a tiny flicker of something in her eyes. Not anger, but deep, cold understanding.
"Mr. Clayton," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You asked me to show the real numbers to demonstrate discipline, to show how close we sail to the edge. The real numbers are what generate the liquidity alerts. If I filter the data, it ceases to be the real numbers. It becomes the sanitized report we usually use." She wasn't challenging him. She was simply defining the parameters he had set. She was holding him accountable to his own demand for unadulterated transparency. Mark felt a tightening in his chest. He couldn't argue the logic. He had backed himself into a corner with his own rhetoric. "Right," he muttered. "Well, thank you for clarifying, Evelyn. Carry on." He walked away, leaving her to her work. He knew he hadn't won. He hadn't even scratched the surface of her composure. He realized then that the denial of her overtime pay hadn't led to an emotional outburst. It had led to a procedural execution of justice. She had used his own words and his own requested report to expose his hypocrisy, and she had done it without raising her voice or breaking a single rule. Mark returned to his private office, the door clicking shut behind him. He sat at his large dark wood desk, trying to process the shift in tower dynamics. He was the millionaire, the owner of the tower, the authority figure. Yet, for the first time, he felt like the junior employee, nervously waiting for the next performance review. The memory of Andrew Russell, the young accounts assistant, flashed through his mind. Andrew had been sitting right there, watching the dates align. The managers would be discreet, but Andrew was young. He might talk. Mark needed to ensure the chain of silence was absolute. He picked up the phone again. "Evelyn," he said when she answered, "I need you to pull the minutes from the executive review and send Andrew Russell to see me, immediately."
He had to control the one person who wasn't senior enough to understand the unspoken rules of corporate omerta. Andrew had seen the alignment of the dates, and that detail was the most damaging piece of evidence of all. Mark had to find out how much the boy knew and how to silence him, not with a threat, but with an offer that would buy his silence and loyalty. He needed to turn the junior accounts assistant into an accomplice. Mark leaned back, massaging his temples. The foundation of his control was cracked. He had to rebuild it, brick by expensive brick, starting right now. And he knew deep down that Evelyn Grace was the most dangerous variable in his entire operation. She had demonstrated that the biggest threat to his carefully constructed image wasn't external competition, but the absolute, undeniable truth, delivered politely, on time, and completely unfiltered. He waited for Andrew Russell. The clock on his desk ticked loudly, counting down the minutes until payroll needed to be covered. Mark was a man used to giving orders, not making pleas. Yet, as he waited for Andrew Russell, the junior accounts assistant, he felt the cold sweat of desperation prickling the back of his neck. He paced his large office, the thick carpet muffling his steps. Andrew was just a kid, really, fresh out of college, probably making $40,000 a year. Mark needed to approach this not as a reprimand, but as an opportunity, a private, confidential ascension. He needed to make Andrew feel like he was being chosen, not silenced. The biggest danger wasn't Andrew's moral outrage. It was Andrew's youthful inability to keep a secret. Mark had to buy that silence, and he had to buy it fast, wrapping the bribe in the heavy velvet of corporate importance. A soft knock came out the door. "Come in," Mark commanded, sitting quickly behind his desk, adopting a posture of calm authority that felt utterly fake.
Andrew entered, looking like a nervous fawn caught in headlights. He clutched a slim notebook, his thick-rimmed glasses slightly askew. He kept his eyes fixed on a point just above Mark's head. "Mr. Clayton, Evelyn said you wanted to see me." Andrew's voice was thin, slightly breathy. "Yes, Andrew. Come in. Sit down." Mark gestured toward the expensive leather chair usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations. Andrew perched on the edge, looking ready to bolt. Mark leaned forward, softening his voice. He dropped the usual lecture tone. "Andrew, I want to talk about the meeting this morning, specifically about what you saw." Andrew swallowed hard. "Sir, I just took the minutes. I was just observing the data." "Exactly," Mark purred. "And you observed well. You have an eye for detail, Andrew, a very sharp eye. That's why you're here and not processing invoices in the basement." Mark paused, letting the compliment sink in. He needed Andrew to feel elevated, to feel like his perception was a valuable asset, not a liability. "That live feed," Mark continued, lowering his voice further, creating an atmosphere of shared confidence. "That was raw data, Andrew. Extremely sensitive, proprietary information.
It was designed to show the executives the volatility of our cash flow, how quickly things can change. He smiled warmly, a gesture he rarely deployed on employees below the VP level. Now you are smart enough to have noticed the timing, weren't you? Andrew shifted in his seat. He couldn't lie, not to this man, not when the evidence was so stark. I noticed the dates on the personal transfer, sir, and the date the TechServe payment was put on hold. Mark nodded slowly, maintaining the smile. Excellent. That's exactly the kind of analytical thinking I value. You connected the dots. Most people in that room just saw red numbers. You saw a cause and effect.
Mark pushed the leather portfolio across the desk. Andrew, those transfers, the urgent ones, they were related to a high-level corporate acquisition strategy, a very sensitive play that required immediate liquidity from my private holdings. It was a complex internal maneuver designed to leverage personal capital before the bank transfer systems could catch up. It was necessary but highly confidential. You understand? He didn't wait for Andrew to respond. He didn't want Andrew to analyze the gaping holes in that explanation, like why a corporate acquisition required a transfer labeled private real estate, or why it was routed through the Cayman Islands. He just needed the narrative accepted. This is the kind of high-stakes, rapid-response finance that runs this company, Andrew. It's the truth behind the curtain. And you, Andrew, are one of the very few people who has seen it. Mark opened the portfolio. Inside was a single printed document. I need someone with your precision, your discretion, and your keen eye working directly on this level of operation. No more minutes, no more junior accounts. Effective immediately, you are being promoted to confidential financial liaison, reporting only to me. Andrew stared at the document, his mouth slightly open. Confidential financial liaison? Yes, Mark confirmed. It's a new position. It comes with a substantial increase in compensation. Let's start with a 75% raise, effective today, and a mandate for absolute discretion regarding all treasury operations you observe. Mark looked straight into Andrew's eyes. Your loyalty, Andrew, is now tied to the highest level of this company. Your success is my success, and your discretion is the foundation of that success. It was a classic move. Turn the witness into the gatekeeper. Andrew wasn't being asked to lie. He was being asked to redefine the truth as confidential information that only he and Mark shared.
Andrew looked down at the document, his hands trembling slightly. 75%. That was life-changing money. It meant paying off his student loans, moving out of his cramped apartment, maybe even buying a car that didn't constantly worry him. Mr. Clayton, I accept, Andrew stammered, the ambition overcoming the fear. He was being pulled into the inner circle. The sheer weight of the opportunity crushed any ethical resistance. Good, Andrew, very good. Mark took a pen from his desk and slid it across the mahogany. Sign here confirming receipt of your new terms and your understanding of the strict confidentiality agreement. Andrew signed quickly, his signature slightly shaky. Mark took the document back, tucking it away. Now, about the meeting minutes. Evelyn will be sending them over shortly. I need you to review them carefully. Ensure that the record of the meeting reflects the intent of the discussion, which was to stress the need for operational discipline and to highlight the volatile nature of cash flow. He leaned in one last time. Any discussion of specific transaction codes, personal accounts, or the precise timing of transfers is extraneous detail that could confuse the record. We focus on the high-level strategy, Andrew. We protect the company's proprietary information. Andrew, now a confidential financial liaison, nodded with newfound seriousness. Understood, Mr. Clayton. Focus on the high-level intent. Protect the proprietary information. Mark had won. Andrew Russell was now bought, sealed, and delivered. He was no longer a witness. He was an investment. You may go, Andrew. Congratulations on the promotion. Start thinking like an executive now. Discretion is everything. Andrew stood up, feeling taller than when he had entered. He nodded again, thanked Mark profusely, and left the office, closing the door softly behind him.
Mark leaned back, exhaling slowly. One crisis averted. The immediate threat of gossip from the lowest ranks was neutralized. Just as he was reaching for the phone to call his PR team, his computer chimed. An email from Evelyn Grace. Subject, Executive Review Minutes, 07/16/2024. Mark opened the email instantly. The attached document was a PDF of the minutes, meticulously formatted. He scrolled through. Evelyn had captured every single one of his long-winded lectures on fiscal responsibility and zero-based budgeting.
The manager's comments were also included, brief and terrified. He reached the section detailing the data presentation. Mr. Clayton requested Evelyn Grace to display the new live cash flow report for the benefit of the executive team, emphasizing the need for unadulterated transparency. The resulting display confirmed significant volatility in the daily operating balance, triggering liquidity alerts due to the rolling balance dipping below the internal threshold for the third time this month. Mr. Clayton concluded that the data successfully illustrated the razor's edge upon which the company operates, reinforcing the need for immediate operational restraint. Meeting dismissed at 10:15 a.m. It was perfect, technically flawless. It didn't mention the Cayman account, the private real estate, or the delayed supplier payment. It only mentioned the result, volatility and liquidity alerts, and reinforced Mark's stated intent to teach restraint. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. Evelyn had given him exactly what he needed for the official record, protecting him without compromising her own professional integrity. She had documented the procedure, not the crime. But then, Mark noticed the very bottom of the email, below Evelyn's signature block. There was a single tiny line of text, added as a footnote, in a slightly smaller font size, almost like an afterthought. Note: per Mr. Clayton's specific request, dated 06/2024, the display was sourced directly from the Treasury Management System, TMS, utilizing the forensic unfiltered data stream, ensuring all transaction categories were visible. Mark stared at the line. It was utterly unnecessary for the minutes. It was purely informational, but it was a statement. It was Evelyn telling him, without ever saying a word aloud, that she knew exactly what she had shown the room, and she had documentary evidence confirming that he had requested the unfiltered feed. It was her insurance policy. If Mark ever tried to claim that Evelyn had acted maliciously or displayed the wrong report, this single line of text would confirm that she was simply following his written instructions to the letter, utilizing the most transparent data stream available. It was a silent, professional threat. Mark deleted the email instantly, knowing he couldn't keep it, but the message was already burned into his memory. Evelyn Grace was not just quiet, she was calculating. He had to move on. Payroll. That was the next immediate fire. He called his private wealth manager again. The transfer from his investment portfolio, the one he had called about earlier, was going to be massive. It would cover the $155,000 payroll, plus several $100,000 more to ensure the operating account looked healthy enough to stave off another liquidity alert for the rest of the week. Yes, Mr. Clayton, the transfer is executing now, the manager confirmed briskly. But I must advise, this liquidates the entirety of the high-growth tech fund you established last year. That's a significant capital loss on paper. I understand the loss, Mark snapped, gripping the phone tightly. Just execute the transfer. I need those funds in the operating account by 2 p.m. Central Time, no exceptions.
He hung up. The cost of maintaining the illusion of discipline was now astronomical. He had sacrificed future growth, a legitimate, disciplined investment, to cover his past recklessness, a down payment on a luxury property, and an offshore stash. As the afternoon wore on, Mark tried to regain control of his company, but the silence from the executive suite was deafening. The managers weren't speaking, but they were definitely communicating through their actions. Maria, the head of HR, sent him an email requesting an immediate private meeting to discuss unforeseen budget freezes impacting Q3 hiring targets. Translation: she was worried he wouldn't be able to cover the salaries for new hires, and she was putting the hiring process on pause. Susan, the logistics head, who had stopped tapping her pen during the meeting, sent a memo stating that all non-critical shipments were being delayed by 48 hours to optimize carrier scheduling and reduce immediate expenditure. Translation: she wasn't risking paying a shipping invoice until she was absolutely certain the company had the cash. The entire organization was seizing up, paralyzed by the fear and distrust Mark had inadvertently unleashed. His demand for operational restraint had been taken literally, but not because they respected his authority. They were enacting restraint because they no longer trusted his ability to fund their operations.
Mark felt the walls of the glass room closing in on him. He wasn't just exposed, he was crippled. His power didn't come from his title, it came from the belief that he was financially invulnerable. Once that belief was shattered, his orders became suggestions, and his managers started protecting their own departments from his mistakes. He called Evelyn back into his office late that afternoon.
"Evelyn," Mark said, gesturing for her to sit, though she preferred to stand by the edge of the desk. "I need you to run a new report, a projection. Assuming the Omega Corp revenue delay extends to T+5 days, and factoring in the immediate payroll transfer we executed today, I need to see the minimum operating balance for the next 3 weeks." He was asking her to quantify the damage. Evelyn set her tablet on the desk and began tapping. She worked silently for 2 full minutes, the only sound the faint clicking of the keys. Mark watched her hands, efficient and emotionless. Finally, she pulled up the projection. It was grim. Even with the emergency transfer from his private portfolio, the operating balance would hover dangerously close to 0 by the end of the following week. The company was structurally unsound, relying entirely on Mark's personal wealth as a backstop. "This is unacceptable," Mark muttered, running a hand through his perfectly slicked hair. "We need more incoming revenue now. What is the status of the smaller client invoices, the ones due this week?" "They are being processed, sir," Evelyn replied. "However, several clients have been delayed in their payment processing due to recent correspondence from our accounts payable department regarding the TechServe hold." Mark frowned. "What correspondence?" "The standard delay notice, sir," Evelyn explained, her tone perfectly neutral. "When a major supplier payment is put on hold, the system automatically generates a template letter to several key clients, citing a temporary review of financial processing workflows as the reason for any potential delays in our internal services. It's a standard risk mitigation procedure." Mark felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He hadn't realized the automated system was so thorough. By holding the TechServe payment to fund his private transfer, he hadn't just angered one supplier. He had sent a coded warning to his most important clients. Clayton is having money problems. "And who authorized that correspondence?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "The system, sir," Evelyn stated. "It was triggered by the delay of the $89,000 payment. It's part of the procedural safeguards implemented after the 2008 downturn. The system flags large payment delays as an indicator of potential instability and preemptively manages client expectations." Mark wanted to scream. He was being fought not by rivals, but by his own automated compliance systems, triggered by his own recklessness, and patiently explained by the secretary he had recently denied a meager overtime payment. "Get those letters recalled immediately," Mark ordered. "Tell accounts payable there is no review of financial processing workflows. The TechServe payment will be made tomorrow morning, priority wire." "Yes, Mr. Clayton," Evelyn replied. "I will inform accounts payable. However, you should note that expediting the TechServe payment will necessitate drawing another $89,000 from the Emergency Reserve Fund, which is currently holding the funds you transferred this afternoon." Mark felt like he was playing a game of corporate whack-a-mole, constantly shifting the same pile of money around to cover holes that kept appearing faster than he could fill them. "Just do it," he sighed, defeated. "We cannot afford to look unstable to our clients. And Evelyn," he added, looking at her sharply, "ensure that Andrew Russell is fully briefed on his new role by the end of the day. Confidentiality is paramount." Evelyn nodded. "Andrew is currently reviewing the minutes, sir. He seems very eager to begin his new responsibilities."
She didn't mention the 75% raise or the confidentiality agreement. She didn't have to. She knew Andrew was bought, and she knew Mark knew that she knew. Mark dismissed her, watching her walk back down the hall. He was now operating under the constant, silent supervision of Evelyn Grace. Her power wasn't overt. It was the quiet, absolute power of the person who controls the data stream and documents the procedure. He turned his attention back to the managers. He had bought Andrew, but what about the others? The middle managers, the ones who truly ran the day-to-day operations, were still operating at a crawl. Mark needed to show strength. He needed to reassert his control by creating an external enemy. He needed a distraction. He called his head of marketing, David Chen, into his office. "David," Mark said immediately, cutting through any pleasantries, "we have a perception problem. The market needs to see that Clayton is not just stable, but aggressive. I want an immediate, high-profile acquisition target identified, something that will make headlines, something that screams growth and confidence." David looked surprised. "Sir, with all due respect, our current liquidity position."
I don't care about liquidity right now, David. I care about narrative, Mark interrupted fiercely. I just moved significant personal capital into the company. We are flush. But the market doesn't know that. They need a story. Find me a target. I want a press release announcing a potential acquisition by Friday, something big enough to drown out any internal whispers. Mark was doubling down on the performance. If his internal control was gone, he would substitute it with external spectacle. He would use the appearance of power to restore the reality of it. David, sensing the shift in the corporate wind, nodded quickly. Understood, Mr. Clayton. Aggressive growth narrative. I'll get the team on it immediately.
As David left, Mark felt a flicker of his old confidence return. This was his element: risk, spectacle, and narrative control. He would fight fire with fire. But as he sat there, planning his grand corporate gesture, his phone rang. It was his private wealth manager again. "Mr. Clayton," the manager said, his voice tight with professional concern, "I have just received an inquiry from your bank regarding the recent large, unusual transfers. They are flagging the movement from the investment portfolio to the operating account, and then the subsequent large, urgent wires, the Cayman transfer, the real estate payment, and now the TechServe payment. They are requesting documentation on the purpose of these high-velocity movements of capital, citing anti-money laundering protocols." Mark's blood ran cold. The bank wasn't just observing, they were scrutinizing. "Tell them it's routine internal treasury management," Mark insisted, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "I can tell them that, sir," the manager replied cautiously. "But the dates and the velocity are highly irregular. The rapid movement of personal funds into the corporate account, followed by immediate, urgent external wires, suggests, and I'm quoting the bank's compliance officer here, a potential attempt to mask the source or destination of funds." Mark slammed his fist lightly on the desk, careful not to look aggressive through the phone. He had been so focused on managing his image with his employees that he had forgotten the ultimate adult in the room, the bank. "They want documentation, sir, specifically regarding the purpose of the initial personal wires," the manager stated. Mark knew exactly what documentation they wanted. They wanted to know why he was sending huge sums to the Cayman Islands and private real estate while simultaneously delaying supplier payments. The paper trail now existed, and it was screaming recklessness.
"I will handle the bank," Mark said, his voice dangerously low. "Do not provide them with any documentation until I have reviewed it." He hung up, breathing heavily. He had created a massive, documented financial liability. His urgent need for offshore liquidity had now triggered a chain reaction that went far beyond internal embarrassment. He looked at his calendar. He had a board meeting scheduled for the following week. If the bank flagged this activity, the board would ask questions, and if the board asked questions, they would demand transparency. And Mark knew exactly who they would ask to pull the unfiltered report. He stood up and walked to the door of his office. He needed to speak to Evelyn one more time. He needed to know if she had any records of the bank's internal flagging system, any template for responding to compliance inquiries. He needed to know if she was a threat or just an employee. He found her at her desk, typing. "Evelyn," he said, standing over her, "hypothetically speaking, if a bank were to question the velocity of our recent transfers, what is the standard compliance response?" Evelyn paused her work, not looking up. "We typically provide the data stream requested by the compliance officer, sir, but we always include a procedural note confirming that the data was shared at the client's explicit request and that the client is aware of the regulatory implications of high-velocity transfers between personal and corporate accounts." The regulatory implications, the phrase hung in the air. Mark felt an intense, burning frustration. He couldn't trust her, but he couldn't fire her. She was the only person who knew the systems well enough to potentially bail him out or hang him out to dry.
"Evelyn," Mark said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I need you to work late tonight. I need you to pull every single document related to the bank's compliance protocols from the last 5 years. I need to understand exactly what they are looking for." "Of course, Mr. Clayton," Evelyn said, looking up for a moment. Her expression was tired, perhaps, but still utterly placid. "And Evelyn," Mark continued, a calculated risk rising in his mind, "I know you worked late last week on the quarterlies. I apologize for rejecting your overtime request. Please resubmit it and add a 50% bonus to that total. It's deserved." He waited for a reaction, a smile, a thank you, anything. Evelyn simply nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Clayton. I will ensure the documentation is thorough." She didn't mention the previous rejection. She didn't acknowledge the bribe wrapped in a bonus. She simply accepted the instruction and the resource and immediately returned to her work. Mark walked back to his office, the heavy silence of the corporate machine following him. He was paying his witness, Andrew, placating his managers with a fake acquisition, and now he was paying his executioner, Evelyn, a hefty bonus just to keep the knife she held sheathed. He realized the terrible irony. He had built his entire identity on financial discipline, but now every action he took, from the promotion of Andrew to the bonus for Evelyn, was a massive, desperate, and ultimately reckless expense, all designed to cover up the original sin of his urgent personal spending. Mark sat down, the lights of the Chicago skyline beginning to flicker on outside his glass cage. He knew the acquisition narrative would buy him a few weeks of breathing room, but the bank was watching, the managers were suspicious, and Evelyn Grace was running the clock. He was no longer the adult in the room. He was just a man frantically trying to outrun the consequences of his own demands for transparency.
He looked at the empty spot on his desk where the live cash flow had flashed red warnings earlier. He had asked for the truth, and the truth was now the most expensive thing he owned. He had to prepare for the board meeting. He had to spin this financial chaos into a strategic masterpiece. And he knew, deep down, that the key to his survival lay not in his own expertise, but in the quiet, precise hands of his secretary. He needed to know what Evelyn Grace was truly thinking, and he had no idea how to find out. She was the perfect, unreadable mirror of his own recklessness. Mark spent the next few days in a frantic, controlled panic. The acquisition news was out, splashed across the financial wires on Monday morning, exactly as he'd planned. The market reacted positively. A small jump in the stock price, a temporary relief. The narrative of aggressive expansion was covering the stench of urgent personal transfers. He needed to maintain this illusion through the board meeting, scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. He met with Andrew Russell repeatedly, reinforcing the new narrative. "Remember, Andrew, we are framing this volatility as strategic capital reallocation. It's sophisticated finance. It's what separates us from the amateurs." Andrew, still basking in the glow of his 75% raise and the feeling of being in the know, nodded vigorously, rewriting every piece of historical data Mark requested. But Mark knew the real danger was Evelyn. He had given her the bonus, and she had accepted it with the same quiet dignity she used to accept rejection. She was a black box. He couldn't read her intent, only her flawless execution. On Tuesday morning, Mark called Evelyn into his private office, just hours before the board convened.
"Evelyn," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I want to review the presentation one last time. For the board today, we are using the quarterly summary dashboard, the one that shows stable growth and contained expenditure. The acquisition news provides the necessary context for any minor balance fluctuations." "Understood, Mr. Clayton," she replied, holding her tablet. "The presentation is prepared using the Q2 aggregate data as requested." "Good," Mark said, leaning forward, trying to project shared purpose. "And if any board member asks about the specifics of the recent capital movement, the bank inquiry, for instance, we reiterate that it was a highly sensitive internal leveraging of personal assets to secure the acquisition target. We do not delve into the granular details of transfer dates or specific account destinations. We focus on the high-level strategy. Understood?" Evelyn looked at him, her eyes clear. "I understand the stated high-level strategy, Mr. Clayton. I will present the data that supports the narrative of strategic capital reallocation." Her wording was technically perfect, but it left a chill in Mark's heart. She hadn't promised to lie, she promised to support his stated narrative. If the board asked for data that contradicted the narrative, she would simply provide it. The board meeting began exactly at 2 p.m. in the glass room. The atmosphere was formal, heavy, and distinctly less compliant than the executive review had been. 7 board members sat around the table, led by Ms. Harrison, a veteran financier known for her cold, pragmatic approach to corporate governance. Mark launched into his presentation, brimming with false confidence. He spoke about the acquisition target, the market synergy, and the robust financial platform that made this aggressive expansion possible. Evelyn controlled the screen, displaying the Q2 summary, green bars, steady profits, exactly the image Mark needed. He finished his presentation, waiting for the inevitable applause. It never came. Miss Harrison laid her pen down precisely on the table.
Mark, thank you for the overview. The acquisition is certainly bold. However, the board has received a communication from the bank's compliance department. They are requesting a full explanation regarding the recent high-velocity capital transfers, specifically noting a pattern of liquidity stress followed immediately by significant injections from your private accounts. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. The bank had moved faster than he anticipated. Miss Harrison, that is exactly what I just addressed, Mark maintained, trying to keep his voice steady. It was a necessary, rapid leveraging of personal capital to ensure the acquisition was secured without public market speculation. It demonstrates my commitment and the company's solid footing. We understand the narrative, Mark, Miss Harrison countered, her voice dangerously calm. We need the data. The managers who attended last week's executive review have expressed quiet concerns regarding the operational liquidity. We need absolute clarity before we proceed with an acquisition of this magnitude, which would further strain our reserves. She looked directly at Evelyn. Evelyn, Mr. Clayton asked you last week to prepare the live cash flow report. I believe he called it the forensic unfiltered stream. We need to see that data now. We need the real numbers, Evelyn. Show us the 30-day projected liquidity, incorporating all recent transfers and the cost of the proposed acquisition. Mark's heart hammered. He couldn't stop this. He had demanded transparency, and now the board was demanding the exact tool he had created to terrorize his managers. He swallowed hard. Evelyn, please display the 30-day forecast per Miss Harrison's request.
Evelyn stood up, her sensible suit utterly motionless. She didn't touch the live feed. She accessed the internal reporting system and pulled up a document she had clearly prepared specifically for this moment. The screen changed. It was not the chaotic, scrolling red data from last week. This was a clean, professional spreadsheet titled Clayton Enterprises Stress Test Projection T+30. The top line was the rolling balance, projected forward. It showed the balance dropping, until it hit 0 on day 18, exactly as Mark had seen on the projection Evelyn ran for him. Below the chart, Evelyn had included 3 key data points, perfectly aligned with the board's concerns. Metric, current status, implication. Operating reserve days, 18 days post-acquisition, below minimum regulatory threshold, 30 days. Source of recent capital, 98% personal funds, M. Clayton, indicates reliance on private assets for operational stability. Compliance flag status, high-velocity transfers, bank inquiry, requires immediate detailed documentation to regulatory bodies. It was a perfectly distilled, professional execution. Evelyn hadn't shown the Cayman transfer or the private real estate. She didn't need to. She used Mark's own actions, the desperate emergency bailout, to prove that the company was not robust. It was critically dependent on him personally, which was the opposite of disciplined corporate finance. The final, devastating detail was placed in a small box at the bottom of the screen, under the heading, Recent Critical Expenditures. Payroll Obligation Coverage, 07/16/2024, $155,000. Required immediate transfer from personal investment portfolio to meet critical operating deadline.
This single line confirmed everything the managers had suspected and everything the bank feared. Mark Clayton, the self-proclaimed paragon of discipline, was prioritizing private spending over paying his own staff, forcing a massive capital loss to cover basic payroll. The silence in the glass room was total. The board members studied the numbers, their expressions hardening from scrutiny to judgment. Mark tried to speak, tried to spin the source of recent capital as a heroic act of commitment, but Miss Harrison held up a hand, stopping him cold. Evelyn, Miss Harrison said, her voice betraying no emotion, this report confirms that the company is currently not in a position to absorb the financial shock of a major acquisition. Furthermore, it indicates that the corporate operating reserve has been critically compromised, requiring repeated personal intervention. That is correct, Miss Harrison, Evelyn confirmed, her voice utterly neutral. Miss Harrison turned to Mark, her gaze ice cold. Mark, your operational judgment is now under review. We cannot have the stability of this company dependent on your personal last-minute transfers. It is fiscally reckless. She didn't use the word discipline. She used reckless. Effective immediately, Miss Harrison announced, looking around at the other board members who nodded their agreement.
The acquisition is suspended. The board is appointing an independent chief restructuring officer, CRO, to oversee all financial operations. The CRO will report directly to the board. Mark opened his mouth, a protest forming in his throat, but Miss Harrison continued, delivering the final, crushing blow.
Evelyn Grace, Miss Harrison said, turning back to the secretary. Due to your intimate knowledge of the TMS system and your demonstrated professionalism and adherence to mandated transparency, you will now serve as the primary financial operations liaison to the board and the incoming CRO. You will retain your current title, but your reporting structure changes immediately. You will report only to the board's oversight committee and the CRO. It was a quiet coup. Evelyn hadn't been fired, she hadn't been reprimanded, and she hadn't even been promoted with a fancy title. She had been given something far more valuable: absolute procedural independence from Mark Clayton. Her role was now mandated by the board to be the source of truth, bypassing the man who had tried to control the narrative. Mark looked at Evelyn, searching for a sign of triumph, a flicker of satisfaction over the denied overtime pay. There was nothing. She was simply doing her job, following the highest instruction given to her. She was the adult in the room now, confirmed by the highest authority. "This is unacceptable," Mark finally managed, standing up, his polished veneer cracking. "I am the founder. This is my company. You can't strip my financial authority." "We can and we have, Mark," Miss Harrison stated, rising as well. "Your reliance on image over stability has created a regulatory risk. We are protecting the company from further exposure. The meeting is adjourned." The board members rose and filed out, speaking in low, urgent tones. They left Mark standing alone at the head of the long table. Evelyn, still by the screen, began the professional process of shutting down the meeting. She didn't look at Mark, but she didn't leave either. She was waiting for the board members to clear the space, waiting for the CRO to arrive, waiting for her new instructions.
Mark walked slowly toward her, his expensive suit feeling like a straitjacket. The glass walls of the room, which he had loved for their transparency, now felt like a prison cell, exposing his failure to the entire city. "You knew," he whispered, his voice thick with realization. "You knew what that data would do." Evelyn finally looked up, her expression tired but steady. "Mr. Clayton, I followed your instructions precisely. Last week you asked for the raw truth, and I provided it. Today the board asked for the projected reality, and I provided that too. I adhere to the highest standard of financial transparency." She didn't accuse him of hypocrisy. She didn't need to. The data spoke for itself. "I gave you the bonus," Mark insisted, grasping at straws. "The overtime pay. Why didn't you just let the narrative stand?" "The narrative, sir," Evelyn said, her voice remaining level, "is separate from the financial reality. My duty is to the integrity of the data stream, regardless of the narrative being presented. The system flagged critical instability, and I am required to document that instability for the appropriate authorities, which is now the board." She packed her tablet into her bag, her motions efficient and final. She had built her armor out of procedure and documentation, and Mark's rhetoric had been the only weapon she needed. "I need you to prepare my office for the CRO," Mark ordered, his last attempt at a command. "I've already contacted the facilities team, sir," Evelyn responded. "They are preparing the office adjacent to yours. I will be situated there for ease of access for the oversight committee." She was moving up, right next to him, now serving as his functional superior. Mark watched her walk to the door. She paused, her hand on the handle, ready to step out into her new, powerful role. "Evelyn," Mark called out, his voice weak.
Why?
She turned back, and for the first time since the meeting, a faint, almost imperceptible emotion crossed her face. Not anger, but profound disappointment. "Mr. Clayton," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of years of observation. "You built this company on the idea that discipline creates admiration, but you confused discipline with deprivation. You demanded restraint from everyone else while practicing recklessness yourself. I simply showed the system what happens when the foundation of control is a lie." She didn't wait for a response. She opened the door and stepped out, closing it softly behind her.
Mark stood alone in the glass room, the city lights reflecting the harsh truth of the data that had just brought him down. He had sought admiration through control, but he had lost everything the moment he, the ultimate adult in the room, had thrown a financial tantrum and prioritized his own urgent needs over the stable operation of his empire. He was left with the silence, the shattered image, and the overwhelming knowledge that the most dangerous person in the room was always the one who held the keys to the truth, and who waited patiently for the exact moment when the loudest voice demanded that truth be revealed. Mark Clayton picked up his briefcase, the weight of his defeat pressing down on him. He walked out of the glass conference room and down the long, silent hallway, no longer the master of the tower, but just another employee under review, heading toward an uncertain future managed by the quiet efficiency of Evelyn Grace. The real cash flow, he finally understood, was not measured in dollars, but in the trust he had squandered, and that balance was now permanently in the negative. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to see how integrity wins in the long run.